What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. In anticipation for the Mandalorian series that will be premiering on Disney Plus tomorrow, I wanted to make a discussion format video where we went over who the Mandalorians are, a brief history of them as a race, and sort of how they began and where they are now. Sort of a fall from grace, and of course how they eventually rose. I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Anthony, who's going to start off with the beginning history of the Mandalorian culture.
Well, to nobody's surprise, the Mandalorians are from the planet Mandalore, and they're kind of like this civilization of humans that are a little bit more powerful than humans. They're a little faster, a little smarter, a little stronger, but they also have this war mentality. They have this desire to crave power. There was a whole lot of infighting. There were like different, like separate, almost like tribes of Mandalorians on the planet Mandalore, but eventually, different clans, and eventually over time they decided to unify their efforts and then spread to the inner rim of the galaxy, trying to take over planets, which they were actually pretty successful at because they're a very powerful group of like Mandalorians.
Right.
Yeah.
Initially, there were a lot of infighting, as Anthony said, among themselves. A lot of the popular weaponry for Mandalorians that we know now had not yet been invented. We'll go over the sort of period of time when they did progress more mentally into, like, invented their armor and more weaponry that was much more adept at killing Jedi and much more adept at killing, period. But initially, they did wear armor and they used swords. They also used blasters as well, but their primary weapons were swords that were a little bit more technologically advanced than the ones that we have now. But again, eventually they decided to join forces, and in unity, they spread their power over different worlds, not just worlds inhabited by their own Mandalorian race and culture. This was before the events of the Republic, before the Old Republic was ever really organized. But during this time in the interim, the Republic, the Old Republic, was actually organizing, and the Jedi Order was becoming more prominent throughout the stars as well, as sort of these protectors of the Old Republic era. During this time, though, the Mandalorians began their expansion, and they began going to planets that, again, were not just Mandalorian ruled and had started as a Mandalorian culture. And as a result of that, they worked their way from the outer rim to the inner rim. But this eventually caught the attention of the Jedi Knights. And the Jedi Knights, who have now been firmly established as the protectors of the inner rim galaxy and the Republic, began coming into constant conflict with the Mandalorians. Initially, the Jedi Order severely outclassed the Mandalorians as far as weaponry with the lightsabers and as far as their use of the Force, and the Mandalorians were, for lack of a better term, shook.
Yeah.
As a result of this, the Mandalorians drew back for a short period of time, went back to the drawing board, and eventually invented armor that is lightsaber resistant, blaster resistant, and along with their inherent skill in combat, being akin almost to a Jedi without the use of the Force, they eventually went back and attacked the Jedi with increased and better weaponry, better blasters, better armor, and it was almost a stalemate between the two of them. They began training exactly how to fight Jedi, and if you can kill a Jedi, you can kill basically anybody in the galaxy. And the Mandalorian culture began to be far more successful and would take over a lot of the inner rim worlds. However, they would never become as plentiful in numbers or as far as their technology to really take over the Republic fully. And over time, their conflicts with the Jedi became less and less so, but they still had a shaky relationship with the Jedi Order. There was never really times of prolonged peace between the two organizations, which is really interesting. Until Tar Vizsla, who was a Force sensitive, is the first ever, and to our knowledge, only Mandalorian to be inducted into the Jedi Order. Now, this is where there's a huge shift in Mandalorian culture. Tar Vizsla was a Jedi for some time until it's popularly believed that he left the Order and united Mandalore under a single ruler, of course himself. Because he was so much more powerful than the other Mandalorians, and presumably even the other Jedi, that he could unite Mandalore under his one cause. Again, he most famously developed and created the Darksaber, which is unique, and we haven't really seen any other lightsaber like it. He did this to represent his differences from the Mandalorians as well as the Jedi. It's believed that he constructed this lightsaber to harken back to the swords that the ancient Mandalorians used in combat. Eventually, Tar Vizsla would die after uniting Mandalore and becoming what is known as Mandalore, which is sort of this one leader denoted above all the other Mandalorians. Eventually, he did pass away, and his lightsaber was taken by the Jedi Order. Now, Mandalorians took this as a huge insult, as they viewed that lightsaber as their own, not the Jedi's to take. And so Clan Vizsla, basically Tar Vizsla's family, entered the Jedi Temple, killed several Jedi in doing so, and took the Darksaber from the Jedi Order. And as a result of this, because they held the Darksaber, the other Mandalorians bowed to the will of Clan Vizsla, as Clan Vizsla took over Mandalore. During this time, war engagements with the Jedi became more and more frequent, and unfortunately, after the time of Vizsla ended, Mandalore began infighting yet again. And unfortunately, this would ravage a lot of the homeworlds of Mandalore and a lot of the worlds that they had taken over. Again, with the forces of the Jedi simply being too powerful to counteract all the different clans that were rising up and fighting within themselves. I also want to bring out that this is the period of time in Mandalorian culture where single combat became very popular. Because there was no one denoted leader above all of them in Tar Vizsla anymore, different clan leaders rose up, and there was a lot of infighting there, a lot of single combat, and a whole bunch of clans that ruled a whole bunch of different sections of Mandalore. There wasn't one denoted leader. As a result of that, Mandalorians as a culture became severely weakened, and their planet was sort of torn in half. A lot of it because of constant warfare and constant explosions going off. A large section of what was originally Mandalore became known as the White Desert because it was just utterly destroyed by the Jedi and all the combat. It was also during this time where Mandalorians were still very much a warrior culture, but a new version of Mandalorians arose that wanted to turn the page and become more of a peaceful society. Most famously, Duchess Satine that we saw in the Clone Wars was a great advocate of this, and they eventually had a large role with the Mandalorians that were still loyal to the warrior culture. And amazingly, the more peaceful Mandalorians, because they were more plentiful in numbers, were able to defeat this other group of warrior culture Mandalorians, and they exiled them from their world. This is where the Mandalorians that were exiled, in fact, would gain more of a reputation of bounty hunters and mercenaries because they had no core home anymore. And this is where they began trying to make their way in the galaxy however they could. Popularly, I made a video on this. George Lucas did say that both Boba Fett and Jango Fett are not Mandalorians, but it is possible that they were able to kill a group of Mandalorians that had in fact become mercenaries and steal their armor from them. But this is sort of where the Mandalorians began gaining that reputation of being mercenaries. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, the Mandalorians that were peaceful, they were able to construct sort of these giant domes off of their homeworlds of Mandalore, where they began to flourish and become a peaceful species that were able to become more successful in the galaxy. They were more political. It wasn't just their way or no way. And then, unfortunately for them, the Clone Wars would break out. And because of their sort of shaky history with the Jedi, the Republic weren't super quick to sympathize with them, especially since also during this time period in Star Wars, another organization rose up known as Death Watch from within the ranks of the peaceful Mandalorians. And for those of you that watch the Clone Wars, you know that Pre-Vizsla actually unveiled the Darksaber, being a descendant of Tar Vizsla, and we know how the story went from there. Eventually, Darth Maul would take over Death Watch and all of Mandalore. But at that point in time, another group of Mandalorians would sort of form that were against Darth Maul, believing that no pure-blooded Mandalorian should ever not rule Mandalore. And of course, Darth Maul, being a Night Brother and a Sith Lord, they believed that he was an unrightful ruler of the planet. After this, there was actually an Imperial occupation of the planet of Mandalore, where the Empire decided to essentially take over the planet after it was ravaged again by the Clone Wars, and Mandalorians were all but killed off at this point in time, especially the more warrior culture minded Mandalorians becoming exceptionally rare throughout the galaxy. And they were enslaved by the Empire until the events of Rebels happened, and Sabine Wren, along with other Mandalorians, were able to liberate their people. But this leads me into the plot of The Mandalorian. Of course, quite popularly, we know that it takes place 5 years after the events of Return of the Jedi. So this is a Mandalorian that I speculate is a part of that warrior culture that was exiled to other planets. Or it's also very possible that he was originally a part of Mandalore that was still peaceful, but after the occupation of Mandalore by the Empire, he grew to have a big grudge against them and sort of embraced the more mercenary lifestyle of the Mandalorians. But I think the story of Mandalorians are really interesting because they started out as one of the biggest, most prominent forces in the entire galaxy, and they sort of went downhill slowly but quickly after constant infighting and confrontations with the Jedi, significantly to point out. The Jedi and the Mandalorians were very even for some point in time, and I think that if there wasn't infighting between the Mandalorians and they were more united, like the Jedi Order was united, it could have seen a very different outcome, and the Mandalorians would have been one of the more dominant forces in the entire galaxy during the Clone Wars event. Do you have anything to add about Mandalorians?
Well, if you look at Mandalorians throughout the history of Star Wars, they're kind of like the Jedi's second biggest adversary throughout all different time periods for the most part, because Mandalorians are really incredibly powerful. If you rewatch that Darth Maul pre-Vizsla fight, like pre-Vizsla does not, go down easily. He only, I would say, barely loses to Darth Maul, but because of that, because of their whole Viking-esque warrior mentality, they have all these like really interesting roles throughout the Star Wars galaxy, and it'll be really fun to watch this new Mandalorian show to see exactly where they take that, because it's easy to look at the Mandalorian as just a guy because he's a human-looking character, but what we're going to experience in the Mandalorian, I think, will be a little bit different from that, and it'll be interesting to see what the effects of the Mandalorian's like history is going to be in this TV series, because I'm sure they're going to probably explore that history.
Right. And in my mind, a Mandalorian is almost just as dangerous as a Jedi or a Force wielder because of the fact that their combat style is so advanced and beyond any other culture in the galaxy. This, perhaps even besides just a Jedi or a Sith Lord or those that can use the Force.
Yeah.
The combat style was forged way before the Republic was ever formed. They were in constant wars with one another, which bred the greatest warriors and the greatest warriors to take over Mandalore. But it was truly during their constant engagements with the Jedi where they began to flourish. They began learning how to use short-range combat styles mixed with long-range combat styles, where they were designed to keep Jedi at a distance. But the second a Jedi closed that gap, they had to have an answer to it in melee combat. They legitimately, again, besides the Sith, were the greatest threat to any Jedi.
Yeah.
We've seen Mandalorians mow down Jedi before, in canon, in fact, and it's just so awesome that these beings that cannot really tap into the Force are such a major threat to beings that can.
Yeah, and it's also really cool how powerful their armor is. If you actually look at Darth Vader's armor, he does have Mandalorian pieces implemented into his armor. I think the most notable one is he has like Mandalorian gauntlets, and the Mandalorian also, like, the way their armors are like built, they're like almost impervious to like lightsaber damage. In fact, if you know much about Boba Fett's armor, Boba Fett has upgraded his armor since the time of Jango Fett's armor, and he even has a neck piece that prevents decapitation by lightsaber, because that's how his father died. So, in the Star Wars galaxy, almost anything could be cut through with a lightsaber. But for the Mandalorians to have such advanced armor where like a lightsaber really is pretty ineffective against them is kind of outstanding. And that's why they're such a formidable opponent, besides the fact that they also just have this heightened intelligence, strength, and speed and all that.
Yeah, in many ways, they're almost more advanced than a Jedi, because a Jedi has kept with their single archaic weapon and a lightsaber. While although the Mandalorians don't have the Force, they've been able to progress in ways that the Jedi can't. Again, with their armor, even their fighting style, it's in many ways just as advanced as a Jedi's fighting style. Now, obviously, the big characters in Star Wars like Palpatine, Yoda, Mace Windu, they can definitely take out Mandalorians. But if you put a standard Mandalorian against a standard Jedi Knight, like an Old Republic Mandalorian, I mean, ones that are constantly fighting Jedi, they're equal pretty much. And I'm really excited to see how that's built upon in The Mandalorian, because I think people see a Mandalorian and they see another Boba Fett, but they don't get to realize how much more advanced these Mandalorians truly were and how close they were to Jedi. When I look at a Mandalorian, I definitely see a combatant on the level of a Jedi. And that's how they were able to turn entire tides of war, and why this Mandalorian is going to be such a threat for these Imperial outposts. But pretty much that's all I have to say about the Mandalorian culture. Some of my favorite characters in all of Star Wars. Again, this video was purely canon for those of you that are wondering. And tomorrow, stay tuned, as we'll be talking about the Mandalorian TV series, and I cannot wait. But what are your guys' thoughts on the Mandalorian culture? What are your guys' thoughts on this Mandalorian TV series and the fact how this culture was able to grow to the point where they could fight Jedi and Force wielders? Anyway, my friends, thank you guys so much for watching. May the Force be with you, and have a great day.